This is the Paul McGUIRE Report. I'm Paul McGUIRE. On today's program, once again, we're going to analyze current events from a prophetic and biblical perspective, which incorporates knowledge. Why knowledge? Because knowledge is power. What kind of knowledge am I talking about? I'm talking about, first and foremost, the knowledge of God's Word, Genesis to Revelation. Secondly, I'm talking about all authentic, truthful, applicable knowledge that is not only true, but has integrity to it. Why? Because Jesus Christ said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." The concept that Christ is talking about is not "you shall know a lie, and the lie shall set you free." You shall know a half-truth, and the half-truth shall set you free. No, Christ was very definitive. He said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." So what did Jesus Christ mean by that? Now, this is something that modern evangelical Christians don't get, and I don't mean to be disparaging and unkind, but, you've got to speak the truth, because if you don't speak the truth, you can't free anyone. Ask yourself this question. I asked myself this question and have asked myself this question for 40 years. For 40 years, this question has haunted me. Morning, noon, night, 24/7. And this is why. I grew up in an atheistic household, middle-class household, where people read books like crazy. People were educated. People were self-educated. The people that were my parents' friends were intellectuals, which is just a fancy word for people who think and use their minds and read and reason. And so passing through our home were intellectuals, artists, painters, writers, novelists, financiers, in a whole spectrum of areas. And some of these people went on to be household names, by the way. Now, I was encouraged as a young boy to read. So I developed the habit as a very young boy of devouring books because I had a thirst for knowledge. So I would read like all kinds of science fiction books, because even though science fiction books were fiction, they contained all kinds of scientific truths in an entertaining manner. So I read all the great science fiction authors. Now back then, in Jackson Heights, Queens, 33-39 80th Street, Jackson Heights, Queens, not that far from the neighborhood that Donald Trump lived in, except his neighborhood was upscale to my neighborhood. And so I would walk to the library, which was about 3 long blocks, and I would regularly take out 25 books or so a month, at least. And I devoured books on science, physics, biology, astrology, medicine, psychology, history, and on and on and on and on, because I wanted to be a scientist. Why did I want to be a scientist? Because I thought, based on my parents' atheism, because I was raised an atheist, and I was raised in a home which was militantly secular humanist, and I was taught that there was no biblical God, there was no God, and therefore if I wanted answers, I would have to look at reality. Reality being what my parents taught me way back then. This is like 3rd grade, 2nd grade. My parents taught me way back then about existentialism. Existentialism is just a fancy word for what is real is what you can perceive with your senses, and what is real is what exists And what exists is not a fantasy, it's what you perceive with your senses, which essentially is the same thing as the scientific method. In the scientific method, when it's used properly, the scientist may have a thesis or a theory like Darwin's theory of evolution, but unless you can prove your theory by empirical evidence, that means tangible, realistic, scientific evidence which proves your theory, it's just a theory. So as an existentialist, you only believe what you can perceive with your senses. Now, interestingly enough, secular humanists believe the same thing. They only believe what they can perceive with their senses. Ironically, communism, which is a stepsister, if you will, or Marxism, socialism is a stepsister to atheism. There too, the Marxists, the communists, the socialists only believes what they can perceive with their senses. So the Marxist communists believe that their Marxist revolution is a scientific revolution. So even though my grandmother insisted that I go to religious instruction because I attended public school, once a week we would march from the public school, BS 69, to the Catholic school. And despite whatever faults Catholicism had, at least I got a measure of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the account of the Virgin Mary, the account of the death and resurrection of Christ, so on and so forth. So I was raised in an environment where what was prioritized by my father and mother, because my father was an artist. He painted paintings. His friends were artists. Many of his friends were famous artists. And my father would paint. See, I didn't grow up in a Norman Rockwell, for those of you that are probably too young to know who Norman Rockwell is. He painted those very, very idealistic paintings of the perfect American family with the Bible, and they would say grace on Thanksgiving. It was an idealized Christian, patriotic artwork that reinstilled both Christian values and the best of American values. But I didn't grow up in that Norman Rockwell world with Norman Rockwell paintings. To give you an example, my father would paint very large paintings. They would take up half a wall or whatever. So did his friends. Some of his friends were renowned artists, and the size of their paintings were the size of the side of a two-story house. So back to my father's paintings. My father's paintings were like Alice in Wonderland type paintings, very innocent and charming. They were abstract paintings that were interesting. But my father also painted naked women. Don't be offended. That's my childhood. What do you want me to do? Censor it? My father painted naked women riding motorcycles, women in lingerie. You see, that was my environment. It was a secular humanist environment. It was not a Christian environment. But one thing, or a number of things, that my parents deposited in me was a hunger for knowledge and truth, the desire to read, the desire to research, the desire to be self-educated. So I read philosophy and psychology and all kinds of books. I read the biography of every great scientist. And so I was on a pilgrimage for truth, and I sensed that my parents didn't have some kind of truth. I wasn't sure what that truth was, but I sensed in my inner being, my soul, that somehow I was missing something. So at a very, very young age, I said to myself as a young boy, I said, I'm going to devote my life to finding out the answers to life's three most important questions. Why am I alive? Who am I? And what is my purpose in life? And I studied and struggled, whatever. And I came no closer to the answer years later. So I got involved in the occult, Edgar Cayce, deeply involved in the New Age movement, deeply involved in the psychedelic movement from a scientific standpoint, even as a young boy, searching for truth, searching for answers. Now, the childhood I had was completely out of the box. So, for example, I would read books. I distinctly remember reading two books that were assigned to me to read in grammar school, PEA 69. One book was 1984 by George Orwell, Big Brother and all that stuff. And the other book was called Brave New World by Sir Aldous Huxley. And in both of those books, they portrayed a dark utopia that was going to come in the future. In Huxley's books, they had a scientific dictatorship, and through genetic engineering and drugs, psychedelic drugs like Soma, etc., they created this artificial paradise, which turned out to be a nightmare. The same thing with George Orwell's book. Brave New World, 1984 was a nightmare. Now, I read those books in third grade, totally understood them, totally got them, and they had more influence on me than just about anything for decades later. My teachers and fellow students had no clue as to what those books really meant. And so I would read, I would practice Eastern meditation and all kinds of things. And then finally, growing up in New York City, I attended the University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri, where I had a dual major in filmmaking and a brand new field in the Department of Psychology called Altered States of Consciousness, and figure out what the curriculum was. But I was in a passionate hunger for truth. Now, when I looked at Christianity in New York City, all I saw was a hollow, empty religion, which I wanted nothing to do with. So I continued into this pursuit, and then eventually, after being in the counterculture of the 1970s, being a radical in the counterculture, being involved in Eastern mysticism, etc., I had a miraculous experience. And that was, I was fleeing from a denominational Christian religious retreat. And as I was fleeing from it, I was hitchhiking back to the University of Missouri. And I won't get into it now. You can go into the archives and listen to the entire story. But I was told that God would take care of my rides home, which I didn't take seriously. But God did take care of my rides home. It was like a field of dreams experience. I was out there in the middle of nowhere in the cornfields. My first ride was from a Pentecostal preacher and his wife. They preached the gospel of Jesus Christ to me. Took me as far as they were going. And then my second ride was a station wagon with a guy driving a black, what looked like an undertaker's suit. And he screeched to a halt. And as it turned out, he was a Bible salesman driving a station wagon jam-packed with black leather, gold lettering, King James Bibles. And letting go of the steering wheel, he gave me he didn't believe in seeker-friendly evangelism. He basically told me that I was a sinner, which was true, and that if I didn't accept Christ into my life and ask Christ to forgive me of my sins, that I would spend all eternity in hell. Now remember, I didn't believe in the word sin. That was an archaic concept. I didn't believe in hell. But I prayed the prayer. And we'll pick up on that part later. I prayed the prayer, and the sinner's prayer, and invited Christ into my life, felt nothing. But the next day, I had a whole series of incredible, miraculous experiences where Jesus Christ revealed himself to me, and I knew that I was born again. Now, having said that, that allowed me to step through what Huxley called the doors of perception, because way back in high school, I had read a book. In third grade, I read Huxley's book, Brave New World. A number of years later, in high school, I read Huxley's book, Heaven and Hell and the Doors of Perception, where he said if you took the psychedelic drug mescaline, you would travel through the doors of perception and find ultimate reality. So I conducted my own amateur experiment, took mescaline. The only problem was that I did not find ultimate reality. But the point is that I was encouraged to read. So I was reading Huxley. I was reading hundreds of books a year. Not just the assigned trivial pursuits, standard educational curriculum offered by the University of Missouri or the colleges and universities in America that are designed to dumb you down and indoctrinate you into a particular worldview. I easily tired of that. I was bored with that. And so I read vigorously and researched vigorously by myself. Now, when I contrast that hunger for knowledge, that passion for true knowledge, not trivial pursuits knowledge, and I looked at what I call the mind control factories, the colleges, the high schools, anywhere from getting a BA to your PhD, I noticed that people came out like widgets in a factory. They couldn't think for themselves. They had no understanding of history or anything else. They were dumbed down. They were indoctrinated, which was the intention. When you read Huxley's book, Brave New World, in 1984, and Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, Between Two Ages, you see that these intellectuals, who were all members of the elite, openly stated that the purpose of modern education was not to educate, but to indoctrinate. Now, this is where I'm going with this. After I accepted Christ in my life and I was born again, it was a difficult period for me. Not only did, as I studied the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, as I studied books by like Dr. Francis Schaeffer and others, I re-examined my political, my moral, my spiritual, my theological, my philosophical beliefs in light of the truth of the Scripture. And God began to change me from within. He began to renew my mind. So I went back to New York City, where I was from, and I continued to study and read. Because you see, I made a vow to myself, which was this. I was only interested in Christianity and being born again if it was 100% true. If it was just a cult, if it was just a Disneyland trip, I wanted nothing to do with it. And I vowed that I would leave Christianity. I would exit it as fast as I could if it turned out to be fraudulent. So the more I studied, the more I read, the more I researched, what stunned me was that I discovered firsthand that, number one, this was a shock to me. Number one, I discovered that it is possible to be a Christian and intelligent at the same time. You may think, why was that difficult? I don't mean to be rude, but every Christian I met was essentially an idiot. I mean, not a total idiot, but a quasi-idiot. So that didn't encourage me. But when I did my own research, my own homework, my own reading, I discovered that in any given area that the Bible spoke on, in the New Testament or the Old Testament, and Francis Schaeffer's writings, the complete works of Dr. Francis Schaeffer, helped me enormously. But as I researched, I discovered that in any given area, whether it was the account of creation in the Garden of Eden versus Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, I discovered that the Bible was always, 100% of the time, more accurate, more scientific, and offered what I believe was empirical evidence that testified that biblical truth was true truth, that biblical truth was really true scientifically, and that these theories, like the theory of evolution, were huckster truths. They weren't true. I'll give you an example. I don't know what the latest count is, but evolutionists have collected approximately 80 million fossil records. And the purpose of their collecting 80 million fossil records is because they know they have a big scientific problem. And that is, they propose that after 200 million, 300 million years of pure random chance evolution, that somehow, some way, mankind evolved from a non-living thing, like maybe a pebble floating in outer space, and then the pebble may have landed on a place like Earth, and then the pebble, after millions and millions of years, got hydrated with water or whatever, and suddenly and mysteriously the pebble became a living thing. And so we go from very primitive life forms, like on a molecular level, and then after millions of years, these primitive life forms just randomly and accidentally and by pure chance evolve into sophisticated and more sophisticated life forms. And eventually, men and women, or the human race, Homo sapiens, come into being. Well, that's a great theory, but the problem is Charles Darwin's theory of evolution has no scientific empirical evidence. In other words, there's not one shred of physical evidence that actually proves that his theory is true. Think about that. And so you blow away all the smoke and mirrors behind evolution, and they don't have, according to science, science's own rules, you have to have empirical evidence, physical, objective, empirical evidence to prove your scientific thesis, like that man evolved over hundreds of millions of years through random chance into a higher level being. But they have no physical evidence to prove that. And this would be an example of physical evidence. You would have fossils, imprints in the mud, in the rocks, in the dirt, in the leaves, maybe buried hundreds of feet underground, or found in a cave, or found in an ice cave, or whatever. You would have to see what is called evidence, fossil evidence of the missing link. Now, the missing link, as most of you know, is some kind of scientific evidence that proves what Darwin said, that primitive life forms over time evolved into sophisticated life forms and eventually evolved into human beings. So if that was true, then you would see fossil records. You'd see the foot imprint or or some other kind of biological material, which proves that over time there would be an evolution, and you would see a distinct bridge between, let's say, a chimpanzee or an ape or a lizard or whatever, and you would see fossil records which prove that there's a link. At some point, you would have to find a fossil record that linked a primitive non-human life form. There would have to be a link from a primitive non-human life form to a human being, a real-life human being. But after collecting over 80 million fossil records, there is no fossil record which provides empirical scientific evidence that would be called a missing link. So what does that mean? It means that either the creation account in the Bible is true, or Charles Darwin's theory of evolution is true. They can't both be true at the same time. So this was, I didn't have to be a rocket scientist to see the gaping holes in evolutionary theory. And then as I continued to do research and studying, which I always do, because I just didn't sit there like a bozo in the educational system, in the mind control factories. What's that song by that rock and roll group? Many of you know what I'm talking about. And they sing the famous song. I'm a lousy singer, but I'll awkwardly attempt to sing it to you. Teacher, leave that kid alone. There's that heavy music. Teacher, leave that kid alone. And it's a whole song by Pink Floyd attacking the robotic brainwashing of the educational systems. Teacher, leave that kid alone. So, what was the result? You see, truth was not used in the calculation of so-called determining evolution is true. There was no truth to support it. There was no scientific evidence to support it. But here's where it gets dark and dirty. People like Sir Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, his brother, Julian Huxley. By the way, all these accounts are in my books. You need to read them because they're fast downloads. I mean, you can read them. If you don't want to read my books, read somebody else's books. But read, for crying out loud, because knowledge is power. It's better than being in a classroom or a discussion and being mocked and made fun of because you don't know what you're talking about. Christians need to be intellectually, spiritually. I'm not talking about physically. I'm not talking about the usage of violence. But Christians need to be on a spiritual and intellectual level. The average Christian should be armed spiritually and dangerous intellectually. They should be able to karate chop, dismantle the arguments of their opponents. So why was it that with absolutely no scientific proof, how is it that Darwin's theory of evolution became the predominant religion of our time and societies like America? Well, there were secret occult societies. Now, before you buy me a roll of tinfoil, I'm going to prove what I say. There were secret occult societies in England, in Germany, in the United States, etc., etc. On one hand, the leading intellectuals, authors, writers, philosophers, and scientists who uh, were secretly members of these occult secret societies. And secret societies, such as the Fabian Socialists and the Rosicrucians, and in some cases the Illuminati. See, all these scientists like Huxley and others, and Bertrand Russell, the famous mathematician, atheist, and Julian Huxley, Aldous Huxley's brother, they all pretended to be atheists and humanists publicly. But secretly, they were part of occult secret societies, and they believed in the occult supernatural. So, why is that important? It's important because many of them were Freemasons and occultists and Rosicrucians. And so secretly they believed in the doctrine or doctrines of the Masons and occultists. And one of the primary doctrines of Freemasons and the occultists was that man and woman, man and women were evolving, and we were all on our way to becoming gods. That's the premise of evolution, that we're on our way to becoming gods. See, that's the dirty secret that they hide. So they concealed the real reason for their secret societies, which was to perpetuate this mythology that all men and women are on their way to be gods, and that science and technology and knowledge, gnosis, were merely mechanisms that would enable us to become like gods. So that was the big secret. And so they needed an intellectual argument. They needed a scientific theory. They needed a science. They needed a technology. They needed a substitute religion for Christianity. And so what they developed was a substitute religion for Christianity, and that was called secular humanism, with one of its cardinal tenets or religious doctrines, which is and was Darwinian evolution. And they believe that through science and knowledge and technology, that man could achieve godhood. Now, these are the people that secretly run the world. These are the people that are connected to the wealthiest international banking families that are also involved in the occult. And their goal is, well, not their goal, they rule the world. So right now, America and nations all around the world are on the fast track to bringing about what God warned us about in the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 11. And that is, they're in the process of bringing into fruition what's called Mystery Babylon, which are the secret cult religions that were established at the time of the Tower of Babel or Babel in ancient Babylon at the time of the Tower of Babel. And Mystery Babylon is a secret occult religion where man is a god, where the rulers are gods, and they embrace science, technology, mathematics, chemistry, physics, etc., etc. And in that same category, they don't have separate categories. In the same category, they put under their umbrella things like sorcery, psychic power, ESP, prophets, people with supernatural power, communication with spirit guides, etc., etc. So I've devoted 40 years to researching this. And I came up with a term for this process, which I call the Pharaoh God King system. You can read about the development of the Pharaoh God King system in my books, like A Prophecy of the Future of America, Volume 2, Mass Awakening, the greatest battle for the hearts and minds of mankind in the history of the world, and numerous other books. And in these books, I explain that secret mechanism of control known as Mystery Babylon, hidden from the masses, is simply this. You brainwash the people. You indoctrinate the people with occult religion, with drugs, sorcery, brainwashing, hypnosis, mind control. You indoctrinate the people or the masses, whether we're talking about ancient Babylon, whether we're talking about ancient Egypt with the pharaohs, and you brainwash the people into believing that the rulers of these ancient super civilizations are gods or god kings or god queens. And so once you create that kind of environment, you can induce the masses of people to serve you joyously like slaves. Now, why would they serve you joyously like slaves? Because you've brainwashed them using Mystery Babylon techniques into believing that you, as the king or the queen or the emperor or the empress or the pharaoh or the pharaoh's wife, you have brainwashed them into believing that you are a pharaoh god king or a god king, which means you're not just a mere mortal, you're a god. They're very serious about this. You're a god, and you're not only a god, you're a god king. And therefore, when the people work for you as soldiers or slaves, toiling in horrific slavery, they do it joyously. The masses of people in these super civilizations, of which America is just the latest in a long line of super civilizations, you convince the people that you are genetically, through your DNA, a god king, and so the people serve you as slaves joyously because they believe that by being your slave and serving you, that what they're really doing is they're offering up worship to you as their God. So they don't look at it as servitude or slavery. They look at it as an act of worship to God. This is the Pharaoh God King system. And so they'll build pyramids for you. They'll build the Tower of Babel for you. They'll give you all their money. They'll die for you in battle or whatever it is because they're convinced, as you brainwash them, they're convinced that you're a god. See how this works? Now, this Pharaoh God King system, people who don't know what they're talking about, like, again, I'm not trying to be me, but the vast majority of your Christian friends, the vast majority of your secular friends have no clue whatsoever about how the world really works. And so they don't understand this Pharaoh God system. And they don't understand how you hypnotize, program, and brainwash people into serving their leaders as if their leaders were gods. And they serve their God kings joyously. And that's how they built the pyramids, Tower of Babel, and else. Now, I I expose the secrets of this in my books, sequence, like the day the dollar died. It's important to understand that money, currency, and the dollar is not real. You understand that, right? It's not real. It's an illusion. That currency, money, and dollar is not only not real, but it is it's sorcery and it's magic and it's based on an illusion. Now, before you reject that out of a knee-jerk reaction, before you reject it, you're intellectually honest, and you have no right to reject that until you've first done research, your homework, your studying. This goes back to ancient Babylon. This goes back to ancient Egypt. At the Tower of Babel, during Mystery Babylon, one of the secret components of Mystery Babylon was they developed their own currency, which was on papyrus, which was a form of paper or worthless metal or some kind of clay object. That was their currency or their money. But you see, beginning in Mystery Babylon, when they developed their occultic money system, and all money systems are occultic in nature. Why? You say, why is that? Because the whole concept, you see, you don't learn this in school. I remember attending my first class on economics at the University of Missouri. And so it's a gigantic auditorium. There probably is, 500 students in there, all there to learn economics. And the professor is lecturing. And all the students are taking notes and acting like they know what the professor's talking about. And you can probably guess by now that, it's the nature of my personality. I was going to say to get in trouble. And that may be true. But it's the nature of my personality to ask questions because I'm interested in truth and learning. The rest of these guys, all they want is a grade. And grades are important. I'm not knocking the importance of grades. I mean, after all, how are you going to get a job if you don't have good grades? But that's all they're interested in. They have no interest in truth. So I'm sitting there in my first economics class with about 500 people. The professor is like a machine gun as he's spewing out all this economic theory and economic jargon. But one thing I learned a long time ago, is it's the ability to see through the smoke and mirrors and what. Because as he's bombastically bombarding us with all this so-called economic theory, I'm trying to analyze it. And admittedly, economics was not a key subject for me, despite the fact that I hung out with a particular individual as a childhood friend, Jackson Heights, Queens, who if I wanted to drop names, I could drop his name, and you would know his name instantly because his name is a household household word. And he's one of the wealthiest men, most powerful men in terms of running the world economic system. And we were friends. Now, the fact that we were friends didn't mean I learned anything about advanced economics from him. But I knew him as a regular person, not just I don't want to give away who he is. So I was not overly impressed because when somebody's your friend, there are good parts and bad parts. So anyway, this guy's going on and on and on. I don't understand what he's talking about. That's fine. Everybody else is pretending to know what he's talking about. So I went up to him after the economic lecture, and I used to do this with all my professors, or most. And I simply said to him, I listened very carefully to what you said, sir, but but I've been trying to grasp from listening to you and from doing my first homework assignment, reading the textbook. I'm trying to grasp the basic foundation of money, which is what is money? In other words, the very foundational principle of economics has to be what is money. And not, during the entire time of his course, and the first course, he did not explain what the nature of money was. And so it was very hard for me to move on because there was no explanation of what money was and where money came from. You understand what I'm saying? And believe me, nobody in the class knew what money was and what money came from. Now, at the time I was talking to the economics professor, I didn't know that in my ignorance, I didn't know that I had accidentally stumbled across the great taboo, which is to ask that question. I didn't know that. I naively bumped into the sacred cow. And because I remember him looking at me with this very quizzical smile, this Cheshire cat smile. Because I think he thought I knew more than I did, and I really didn't know as much as he may have thought I knew. I think he thought that I actually knew more about what money was and what the nature of money was than I actually did. Because I really didn't. So I asked him questions and stuff, and he smiled at me as if to communicate to me that there's an open secret regarding money and the global economic system, and we're not going to come right out and tell you in class. He was saying to me in between the lines, you're going to have to figure it out for yourself because we're not going to just give away the secret. I didn't quite get all that at the, but I knew instinctively that there was something that I knew instinctively that I had bumped into a sacred cow, and there was a huge reservoir of truth and information regarding economics and money that was being hidden. Because I suspect, in retrospect, looking back all these years, I think he knew perfectly well. Now, I don't think he would have called money a magical system, a system of illusion. But I think he knew the secret of money to a large degree and the nature of money. And I'll tell you to a limited degree what it is. I explain it in my book, Day the Dollar Guide, which I heavily discounted for you at paulmcguire.us, and in the book, Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind, the World, and A Prophecy of the Future of America, Volume 2, and other books which I discounted for you to help you. Let me just say it quickly. Money is an occultic system. I don't care if it bothers you to say that. It's true. I'm not going to apologize because you don't understand it. Money is an occultic system. Money comes from sorcery. And you say, well, how can you say something so outrageous? Very simple. Very simply. The entire purpose of money, I'm going to say it once. If you want to know more, I'm not just trying to sell a book. You're going to have to crack open one of my books or some book that tells the truth. And I have plenty of documentation and facts to prove what I'm saying. Money is an illusory, magical system. You have to understand. The purpose of money is to conceal power, to exercise domination and control over the ignorant masses by using so-called money or currency as a magical, illusory instrument of domination and control over the masses. Now, that probably whizzed by a lot of people like a UFO landing in Area 51. It's true. I'm picking up my book the day the dollar died. I discounted it like crazy. You can get it at paulmcguire.us. And I would get it with A Prophecy of the Future of America, Volume 2, and The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World. So let me just read you a couple of short sentences, because I don't expect you to believe me. Okay? I really don't. I don't expect you to believe me. It's a big pill to swallow. The question is, are you going to swallow the red pill or the blue pill? That's the question. Because you see, when we talk about money, what we're really talking about is a matrix. And again, the question is, are you going to swallow the blue pill or the red pill? Why is it that evangelical Christians are so epidemically ignorant and deceived and clueless regarding so many subjects, and young teenagers, young men, young women who are not Christians know more about these subjects? Statistically, there's a far higher percentage of rebels, of independent thinkers who are not Christians, who really understand that money is an illusory system, than Christians. Why is it that, I'm not trying to be unkind, I know it sounds like I am, but I'm really not. Why is it there is an epidemic of stupidity in the Christian culture? Now, by that I mean, I'm going to soften this because my motive is love, because I care. Why do I care? Why do I care? Because unless you know the truth, you can't be set free. And I love you. I know that sounds about as corny as you could possibly imagine. But I love you with the agape love of Jesus Christ. I have compassion and concern for you, children, our nation, and our future. And as long as we are clinging to sacred cows, and by the way, a sacred cow is an idol. Just go back to the book of Genesis, when the children of Israel escaped the Pharaoh God-King system. Under Pharaoh, remember what happened? They got all the gold out of Egypt, and then they melted it and created a golden calf. The golden calf was one of the false pagan gods of Egypt, and they melted it in the form of a cow, the golden calf. And then they worshiped the golden cow, by having blatant, outrageously perverse sexual orgies. These are the children of Israel, all around the golden calf. And God judged them severely for it. And this was right after God supernaturally delivered them from the Pharaoh God-King system. And they complained, and they were bitter because they were sentenced into slavery for 400 years by the biblical God to serve the Pharaoh God-King system as slaves. And God sent them a deliverer, Moses. But they didn't like the deliverer. They rebelled. And when you look at the biblical account of the children of Israel when they were serving the Pharaoh God King system as slaves, you know what happened? Well, yeah, you do know what happened. They became morally and spiritually polluted because the children of Israel began to behave, act, worship, and develop a morality that was sinful, that they imitated from the Egyptians, including their sexuality. But the children of Israel, when they were serving Pharaoh in Egypt as slaves, they were happy. They were joyous slaves. Because in a Pharaoh God King system, you're brainwashed and you're programmed to love your slavery. But when God was getting ready to deliver them, he lit a fire under their posteriors. And the way that worked is that the Pharaoh had like these managers over them. These managers were called taskmasters. And what the taskmasters did is that the Pharaoh raised the quota and demanded that the taskmasters make the slaves of Israel make far more bricks per day, but they had less straw and less mud to make the bricks. Those were the primary components of the bricks, mud and straw. And so they were no longer having fun being slaves because the Pharaoh, through the taskmasters, made them produce far more bricks per day than before, but he vastly reduced their supply of straw and mud to build the mud bricks. And that made them miserable. Now, notice God uses that principle throughout history right up until our present moment, right up until our present day. I break this open. I expose the truth of this for you in my book, A Prophecy of the Future of America, Volume 2. It says 2016 to 2017, but that was not smart of me. I should have said 2016 to 2030. A Prophecy of the Future of America. You need to get it because I explain all of this in great detail. So, this is what happened. And the same thing is happening today. Notice what happened. Notice what a consequence of the pandemic is. Notice that the globalist elite are moving us into a new world order and a one world government, a one world religion, and a one world economic system. Notice all that. But notice that especially for the middle class and working class, that's probably most of us, notice that we have to now work maybe 10 times harder than we used to have to work to maintain the same standard of living we used to have. That is exactly the same as Pharaoh's taskmasters raising the quota of the number of bricks we have to make per day, but we're given less mud and straw by which to manufacture the bricks. It's an impossible task. It's going to give you a nervous breakdown. Well, that's exactly what's happening now in America and Europe and across the world. Simply superimpose the truth of the children of Israel slaving under Pharaoh. I explain the entire thing in my book, Prophecy of the Future of America. That's discounted. Get it at paulmcguire.us. And notice the same occultic principle is being used. God's people, that's you and I, we now have to work far harder to make those bricks, but they've cut the supply of straw and mud. translated into our modern time, you could substitute inflation. You could substitute all these restrictions designed to prevent the spread of the pandemic, such as social isolation, quarantines, uh, uh, all the added rules on restaurants, all the added rules on everything. That's the same thing as increasing the quota of bricks, but reducing the supply of straw and mud. Same principle. You're working 10 times harder, but you're getting less, and less. Now, the reason God is allowing that, the reason God is doing that, is for the same reason he allowed it throughout biblical history, especially in Egypt. God's people would slide into idolatry, immorality, paganism, if God left things easy. So since we're in the last days and the Lord is coming, no one knows the date, but the coming of the Lord is getting closer. Our deliverance from being slaves in the Pharaoh God King system, in the system of Mystery Babylon, our deliverance is approaching. Just like in ancient Egypt, as they had to make more bricks with less straw and mud, Moses, where God was moving with supernatural signs, judging the gods of Egypt, Moses was raised up by God supernaturally to be a leader who would deliver the people, the children of Israel, from the hands of Pharaoh, who's a type of the Antichrist or Lucifer in the world system. And notice what God does is he allows it to play out and allows his people to face what can only be described as humanly impossible circumstances. He's allowing his people to be desperate so they can only seek him for deliverance. So what happens is Pharaoh and the armies of Pharaoh and the chariots follow God's people. There's no way out. It looks like Pharaoh's going to slaughter God's people. Moses, the deliverer, raises his staff supernaturally. The Red Sea parts. This is a miraculous deliverance. And God's people cross over the dry land as the Red Sea parts. They get to the other side. And then before Pharaoh and his armies can slaughter them, Red Sea folds back in on Pharaoh, his chariots and armies, and the Red Sea drowns them. They die. It's a miraculous deliverance. This is a parallel truth to what is about to happen with the return of the Lord Jesus Christ. There's going to be a judgment on all the gods of the Pharaoh God King system of Mystery Babylon. There's going to be massive judgment. Just read the book of Revelation. The opening of the seals, the seal judgments, the signs of the times, the horrific plagues that are coming upon the earth. And as I outlined for you in my book, Prophecy of the Future of America, Volume 2, I provide for you an entire study of how there are so many similarities between the gods of Egypt, the Pharaoh God King system, and God's supernatural deliverance from the gods of Egypt and the Pharaoh God King system. They're parallel truths. Read Revelation and you're going to see a remarkable parallel, a remarkable similarity between exactly what happens in terms of God judging Pharaoh and the world system and supernaturally delivering his people by parting the Red Sea. And notice this carefully, because I wrote this book before the pandemic occurred. And in the book, you're going to read a revisit that I wrote of how God commanded through Moses, God commanded children of Israel to paint the blood of the sacrificial lamb on the doorposts of their houses. So when he sent judgment upon the land of Israel, upon the land of Egypt, and upon Pharaoh's own household, and the firstborn males of Egypt were dying, including the Pharaoh's own son. Every child of God that obeyed the Lord and applied the blood of the Lamb on the doorposts of their dwellings, when the angel of death came to destroy their firstborn, the Bible says the angel of death passed over the households of the children of Israel, because the angel of death saw the blood of the Lamb, and the angel of death passed over the homes of the children of Israel, and they were spared death. Thus, that expression, the angel of death passed over, like in Passover lamb and the Passover celebration, the angel of death passed over the homes or the houses of the children of Israel, and they were spared destruction from disease and death. That wasn't put in there by God to be cute. If you will, by faith, and I teach you how to do this, if you will, by faith, apply the blood of the Lamb, Jesus Christ, on the doorposts of your home, your physical dwelling, and the doorposts of your heart and your family's hearts and your children, if you appropriate and apply the blood of the Lamb over your household, the angel of death from pandemic or whatever will pass over your household. That doesn't mean you don't do other medical or practical things, but you need to also incorporate God's spiritual promises, because they're very powerful and very real. Very powerful and very real. Now, so you'll see that in the book. And there is an amazing parallel between the plagues of Egypt, the judgment of God on ancient Egypt, which represents the world system or Mystery Babylon, and God's deliverance, which is coming quickly. God's deliverance is coming quickly to you and me. This is critical that we grasp this. Absolutely critical. Now, back to let me just say this, okay? In the book, A Prophecy of the Future of America, Volume 2, okay? I do an in-depth study of Joseph, an in-depth study of Daniel, an in-depth study of King Solomon, and other relevant truths. And what you will discover is that God supernaturally promotes his people, he supernaturally protects his people, he supernaturally delivers his people, especially in prophetic times. And as I show you in the book, the key thing to understand is that these ancient super civilizations, which were all occultic, the king of Babylon had about 300 heavy-duty, high-level, super powerful, occult, magical, scientific and technological advisors, and they delivered. It wasn't like Disney time, because if they didn't deliver, they were killed by the king of Babylon. In the same way with um, um, the Pharaoh and Joseph, when Joseph was promoted to the Pharaoh's court, notice that the Pharaoh also had about 300 heavy-duty occult sorcerers, psychics, and advisors that advised him on what to do. And we know they were heavy-duty because if they failed Pharaoh, he had them slaughtered. So Daniel was given supernatural answers for the king of Babylon, and Joseph was given supernatural answers for the Pharaoh, and they had to deliver. So, for example, Joseph interpreted a dream supernaturally that the Pharaoh had. It was an economic forecasting dream. And then Joseph was made the right-hand man to Pharaoh. And Joseph constructed, because the Holy Spirit inspired his imagination, Joseph constructed these massive stadiums, like the size of giant football stadiums, etc., to warehouse massive, massive supplies of grain and wheat, etc., so that the empire of Pharaoh could survive the years of famine. And then God gave Joseph economic genius, and he traded all the excess wheat and grain with the surrounding nations to the empire of Egypt, vastly expanding the geographic territory of Egypt. And this genius, this financial genius that God downloaded into both Daniel and Joseph, raised them up to the highest heights. And this is the point that I'm trying to make. God's people were not quivering in fear, cowering in fear in the corner. Understand what I'm saying? God's people were supernaturally raised up to the highest positions. God gave Joseph, Daniel, and his people supernatural wisdom in the economic realm, in food realm, in military realm, in expansion of empire realms. God gave his people supernatural wisdom. Now, the point I'm trying to make is God never intended for his people to be a bunch of bozos on a bus who don't know nothing about nothing. That's bad English, I know. God intended for his people to have knowledge, which gives power. God intended for his people to have vision so that they wouldn't perish. And if you have any doubt about that, read my book where I do a detailed study of this, and then pick up your Bible and read the book of Proverbs and notice the extraordinary emphasis that God places on acquiring knowledge, wisdom, guidance, etc., etc. This battle is for real. God has something for you to do and for his people to do in the last days. And it's not to suck your thumb and complain. Knowledge is power. It is blasphemy before God. It is disgusting before God. It is vile before God. It's an abomination for God before God. It's an abomination before God for his people, for the reputation of his people to be synonymous with being dumb, stupid, and out of it. And that's exactly what our reputation is. So, we must be victorious and rise to the occasion. You're listening to the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. Visit paulmcguire.us. That's paulmcguire.us. Visit it now and help us move forward and reach the world for Jesus.